What would you do if you saw a stranger sabotaging a millionaire's car? A young black boy made a split-second decision that changed his life forever and left his struggling mother in tears. This is the story you won't want to miss. It was a blistering hot afternoon in a small American town. Marcus, a 13-year-old boy, was making his usual rounds through the neighborhood. With a tattered backpack slung over one shoulder and sneakers worn thin from miles of walking, he scoured the streets for scrap cans and bottles to trade for cash. Life hadn't been kind to Marcus or his mom, who worked 2 shifts a day at the local diner just to keep their lights on. But Marcus didn't let it show. He was scrappy, resourceful, and determined to pull his family out of poverty. Somehow, someday. As Marcus approached the parking lot of the town's only upscale grocery store, he noticed a sleek black sports car gleaming under the sun. It was the kind of car he'd only seen in movies, with shiny rims that looked like they were worth more than his entire house. He paused for a moment to admire it, a pang of envy hitting him hard. What would it feel like to own something like that? To live a life where you didn't have to worry about where your next meal would come from. "Focus, Marcus," he muttered to himself, shaking off the thought. He made his way to the row of recycling bins at the edge of the parking lot, careful to stay out of sight. Most people didn't like a kid digging through their trash, even if he was just trying to make a few bucks. As Marcus crouched by the bins, he heard a faint clinking sound. Turning his head, he saw a man in a faded baseball cap crouching near the rear wheel of the fancy car. The man's movements were quick and furtive, his head darting around like a nervous bird. Something about it didn't sit right with Marcus. He squinted, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The man was holding a pair of pliers, tugging at what looked like wires beneath the car. Marcus's heart began to race. Was this guy tampering with the car? Before Marcus could fully process the situation, the man glanced in his direction. Their eyes met for a split second, and Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. The man stuffed the pliers into his pocket and hurried off, disappearing around the corner of the building. "Hey! Wait!" Marcus called out instinctively, his voice cracking with urgency. But the man didn't stop. For a moment, Marcus froze. What was he supposed to do? He was just a kid. Who would listen to him? Then he thought about the person who owned the car. What if they got in and drove off without knowing what had been done? What if something terrible happened? Marcus clenched his fists and ran toward the store entrance. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of fresh bread and floor cleaner. Shoppers moved leisurely through the aisles, pushing carts filled with organic produce and artisanal cheeses. Marcus felt out of place, his dusty clothes and sweaty face drawing a few sideways glances. He didn't care. He had to find the car's owner. Standing near the bakery counter was a tall man in an expensive suit talking on his phone. He looked like he belonged to that car, the kind of guy who'd walk out of this store with a bag of groceries worth more than Marcus's rent. Marcus hesitated for a moment, then steeled himself and marched up to the man. "Excuse me, sir," Marcus said, his voice shaky but loud enough to get the man's attention. The man lowered his phone, a look of mild annoyance crossing his face. "Can I help you?" "Your car," Marcus stammered, gesturing toward the parking lot. "I saw a guy messing with it. He was cutting wires or something under the wheel. I think he might have done something to your brakes." The man frowned, his expression shifting from annoyance to concern. "What? Are you sure?" "Yes, sir. I saw him with my own eyes," Marcus said, nodding emphatically. For a moment, the man just stood there, processing what Marcus had said. Then he pulled his phone back up and barked into it. "I'll call you back." He grabbed a store employee passing by. "Get the manager and tell them to call the police. Now." Turning back to Marcus, the man's voice softened slightly. "Show me." Marcus led him outside, his heart pounding in his chest. He hoped he hadn't made a mistake. What if the guy hadn't been tampering with the car after all? But as they approached the vehicle, Marcus saw the loose wires dangling near the back tire. His stomach twisted. He had been right. The man crouched down to inspect the damage, muttering under his breath. A moment later, the store manager and a police officer arrived. The man in the suit explained what had happened, pointing to Marcus. The officer turned to him. "You saw the suspect?" Marcus nodded. "Yes, sir. He was wearing a baseball cap and he had pliers. He ran off that way." He pointed toward the corner of the building. The officer scribbled notes in a small pad, then radioed for backup. "Stay here," he told Marcus before heading off to investigate. The next few minutes felt like hours. Marcus stood awkwardly by the car, avoiding the curious stares of shoppers passing by. The man in the suit stayed nearby, pacing and checking his watch. Finally, he stopped and looked at Marcus. "What's your name, kid?" "Marcus," he said quietly. The man held out his hand. "I'm Robert Harris. You might have just saved my life." Marcus hesitated, then shook the man's hand. It felt strange, shaking hands with someone so polished and important. "Thank you, Marcus," Robert said. "If you hadn't spoken up, I could have gotten into that car and driven straight into an accident. You did a good thing today." Marcus felt a swell of pride, but also a flicker of doubt. His mom always told him to keep his head down and mind his own business. Would she be mad at him for getting involved? As if reading his mind, Robert smiled. "I'd like to thank you properly. Can I talk to your parents?" Marcus hesitated. "It's just me and my mom," he said. "She's at work right now." Robert nodded thoughtfully. "Well, when she's home, let her know I'd like to stop by. Here." He pulled a business card from his pocket and handed it to Marcus. The card felt thick and fancy, embossed with gold letters that read, "Robert Harris, CEO, Harris Ventures." Marcus stared at it, the weight of the moment sinking in. He wasn't just some poor kid who'd been in the right place at the right time. He was someone who had made a difference. As the police wrapped up their investigation, Marcus walked home, clutching the card tightly in his hand. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the cracked sidewalks. He thought about his mom, about how tired she always looked when she came home. Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something better. Marcus didn't know it yet, but this single act of courage would set off a chain of events that would change his life, and his mother's, forever. The next evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the glow of streetlights flickered on, Marcus sat at the small kitchen table in his tiny home. The kitchen was cramped, the air filled with the faint smell of fried onions from dinner earlier. His mom, Vanessa, was late again, working an extra shift at the diner to scrape together enough for the electric bill. Marcus flipped Robert Harris's business card over in his hand. The fancy gold letters felt out of place against the worn tabletop. He had replayed the events of the previous day in his head 100 times, trying to decide whether or not to tell his mom. On one hand, she'd probably be proud of him for doing the right thing. On the other hand, she might be mad that he got involved in something that could have gone very wrong. Lost in thought, Marcus didn't hear the sound of tires crunching on gravel outside. It wasn't until the faint knock on the front door that he jolted back to reality. His heart skipped a beat. They rarely had visitors, especially not after dark. Cautiously, Marcus peered through the window and froze. Parked in their dusty front yard was the sleek black car he'd seen in the parking lot. Standing at the door was Robert Harris himself, looking as out of place as a diamond in a pile of coal. Marcus opened the door slowly, peeking around it. "Mr. Harris?" he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Robert gave him a warm smile. "Marcus, sorry to show up unannounced, but I wanted to see you and your mom, personally." He glanced over Marcus's shoulder into the dimly lit house. "Is she home?" Marcus hesitated, gripping the edge of the door. Not yet. She's working late." Robert nodded, his expression softening. "I understand. Do you mind if I come in for a minute? Just to talk?" Marcus hesitated again, then stepped aside, gesturing for Robert to enter. The man's polished shoes clicked softly on the worn linoleum floor as he stepped inside. Marcus quickly cleared a few dishes off the table, embarrassed by the mess. "Sorry about the place," Marcus mumbled. Robert shook his head. "Don't apologize. You've got nothing to be ashamed of." They sat at the table, the silence between them thick. Finally, Robert pulled a small envelope from his jacket pocket and slid it across the table. "This is for you and your mom," he said. Marcus stared at the envelope, unsure what to do. "What is it?" "Just a little thank you for what you did," Robert said. "You didn't just save my car, you probably saved my life. That's worth more than I can put into words." Marcus hesitated, then slowly picked up the envelope and peeked inside. His eyes widened. It was stuffed with $100 bills. I can't take this," Marcus stammered, pushing the envelope back toward Robert. "My mom wouldn't want us to owe anyone." Robert smiled gently. "You don't owe me anything, Marcus. This isn't charity, it's gratitude." Before Marcus could say more, the sound of keys jingling at the front door made them both turn. A moment later, Vanessa walked in, her face lined with exhaustion. She froze when she saw Robert sitting at the table. "What's going on here?" Vanessa asked, her voice wary as she set her purse on the counter. Marcus stood quickly, clutching the envelope nervously. "Mom, this is Mr. Harris. He's the guy I told you about, the one whose car I saved." Vanessa's eyes narrowed as she turned to Robert. "I appreciate whatever my son did for you, but we don't take handouts." Robert stood, his expression calm but earnest. "I understand where you're coming from, Mrs. Lewis, but this isn't a handout. Your son showed incredible courage and did something that very few people would have done. I'm here to thank him and to offer you something more." Vanessa crossed her arms, her face guarded. "What kind of offer?" Robert took a deep breath. "I run a real estate company, and we're always looking for reliable people. I'd like to offer you a job. It's steady work. Cleaning, organizing, helping manage properties. It's not glamorous, but it's honest work, and it pays well." Vanessa blinked, clearly caught off guard. She glanced at Marcus, who was watching her with wide eyes, then back at Robert. "Why would you do that?" she asked, her voice suspicious. Robert smiled. "Because your son reminded me that good people still exist in this world, and because I can see how hard you're working to give him a better life. I'd like to help if you'll let me." For a long moment, the room was silent. Marcus held his breath, watching his mom's face. Finally, she let out a sigh and nodded. "All right," she said quietly. "I'll think about it." Robert nodded, a look of relief crossing his face. "Take all the time you need. Here's my card. Call me when you're ready." As he turned to leave, he paused at the door and looked back at Marcus. "You've got a good head on your shoulders, kid. Don't ever lose that." Marcus felt a swell of pride as he watched the man walk back to his car and drive off into the night. When the door closed, Vanessa turned to Marcus, her expression softening. "You really did all that?" she asked. Marcus nodded. "Yeah, Mom. I couldn't just let him drive off like that. It didn't feel right." Vanessa pulled him into a hug, holding him tight. "I'm proud of you, Marcus," she whispered, "more than you know." For the first time in a long time, Marcus felt like things might actually get better. The weight of their struggles wasn't gone, but it felt just a little lighter. And for the first time, Marcus dared to hope that this might just be the beginning of something new. The morning sun spilled through the cracks in the blinds, casting long beams of light across the small kitchen. Marcus sat at the table, doodling in his worn sketchbook, while his mom, Vanessa, stood by the counter, her fingers tapping the edge of the business card Robert Harris had left the night before. The card sat on the table between them, its glossy surface reflecting the sunlight. Vanessa hadn't said much since their unexpected visitor. She wasn't one to trust easily. Life had taught her to be cautious, but something about Robert's offer lingered in her mind. The promise of steady work, a chance to catch up on bills, maybe even the possibility of a fresh start. Finally, she let out a sigh and looked at Marcus. "What do you think, baby?" she asked. "Do you think we can trust him?" Marcus paused, his pencil hovering above the paper. "I think he means it, Mom. He didn't have to come here, you know? And he could have just taken his car and never looked back." Vanessa nodded slowly, her gaze drifting to the card again. She knew Marcus was right. There was no reason for Robert to go out of his way unless he genuinely wanted to help. "All right," she said finally, picking up the card. "I'll give him a call. But don't get your hopes up too high, okay? People don't always keep their promises." Later that afternoon, Vanessa dialed the number, her hands trembling slightly. She wasn't sure what she was more afraid of, that Robert's offer was too good to be true, or that it wasn't. When he answered, his voice was warm and professional. "Mrs. Lewis, I'm glad to hear from you," Robert said. "Have you thought about my offer?" Vanessa hesitated for a moment before replying. "I have. If the job's still open, I'd like to take it." Robert's relief was palpable, even over the phone. "That's wonderful. I'll have one of my assistants pick you up tomorrow morning and bring you to the office. We'll go over everything and get you started." Vanessa thanked him and hung up, her heart pounding. It felt like a gamble, but it was one she had to take, for Marcus, if not for herself. The next morning, a sleek black SUV pulled up outside their house, looking just as out of place as Robert's car had the night before. Marcus watched from the window as his mom stepped outside, her shoulders squared with determination. The driver, a kind-looking older man named George, opened the door for her. "Good morning, ma'am," he said with a smile. "Mr. Harris is looking forward to meeting with you." Vanessa glanced back at Marcus, who gave her a thumbs up from the window. Then she climbed into the SUV and they drove off. At the office, Vanessa was greeted by Robert himself. The building was modern and bustling, a far cry from the greasy diner where she'd spent the last 5 years waiting tables. Robert showed her around, introducing her to a few staff members and explaining her responsibilities. The job wasn't complicated, cleaning, organizing, and occasionally helping with events, but the pay was more than Vanessa had ever earned. By the end of the day, Vanessa felt something she hadn't experienced in years: hope. Meanwhile, Marcus couldn't stop thinking about everything that had happened. He still felt a mix of pride and disbelief that his actions had set all this into motion. Inspired, he started sketching again, his pencil flying across the page as he imagined a better future for himself and his mom. His drawings became more ambitious: houses with sprawling porches, tree-lined streets, and vibrant community spaces. It wasn't just about escaping their current life anymore. It was about creating something that mattered. One evening, as Vanessa looked over his shoulder at his latest sketch, she smiled. "You've got real talent, Marcus," she said. "Have you ever thought about what you want to do when you grow up?" Marcus shrugged. "Maybe I could be an architect or something. You know, design cool buildings." Vanessa ruffled his hair. "You could be anything you want, baby. Don't let anyone tell you different." A few weeks later, Robert stopped by their house again. This time, he brought an envelope and handed it to Marcus. "I was talking to a friend of mine who runs a community center downtown," Robert said. "They have an art program for kids, and I showed her some of your sketches. She was impressed. There's a scholarship available if you're interested." Marcus's eyes widened as he opened the envelope. Inside was a brochure for the art program, along with an application form. I don't know what to say," Marcus stammered. Robert smiled. "Say you'll think about it. You've got a gift, Marcus. Don't waste it." As the weeks turned into months, life began to shift for Marcus and Vanessa. With her new job, Vanessa was able to pay off their overdue bills and even start saving a little. Marcus, encouraged by the opportunity at the community center, threw himself into his art with a newfound passion. For the first time in years, their future didn't feel like a question mark. It felt like a story they could write for themselves, one where hope, courage, and kindness could make all the difference. And it all started with a boy who decided to speak up when it mattered most. Marcus stood in the middle of the community center's art studio, his sketchbook clutched tightly to his chest. The room buzzed with energy. Kids hunched over easels, the smell of fresh paint hanging in the air, and a teacher with a streak of blue in her hair moving from student to student, offering pointers. Marcus felt a knot of nervousness twist in his stomach. He wasn't used to being around so many people, especially ones who seemed so confident. The teacher, Miss Angela, noticed him hovering near the door and waved him over. "You must be Marcus," she said, her smile warm and inviting. "Robert told me all about you. Let me see what you've got." Marcus hesitated, then slowly handed her his sketchbook. He'd spent hours refining the drawings, pouring all his hopes and dreams into every line. Miss Angela flipped through the pages, her expression shifting from curiosity to admiration. "These are fantastic," she said, holding up a sketch of a house with tall windows and a wraparound porch. "You've got a real eye for detail. Have you ever thought about taking this further? Maybe entering a competition?" Marcus blinked, surprised. "A competition? Me?" Miss Angela nodded. "Absolutely. There's one coming up next month. Dreams for Tomorrow. It's open to young artists, and the grand prize is a scholarship to a summer architecture camp. I think you'd be a great fit." The thought of competing, let alone winning, felt surreal. But as he looked around the room and saw other kids working on their projects, a spark of determination lit inside him. "I'll give it a shot," he said quietly, a small smile creeping across his face. Over the next few weeks, Marcus dedicated every spare moment to his competition entry. After school, he'd race home to work at the kitchen table, sketching and refining his design, a community center inspired by his own experiences. It was a place that felt welcoming, with open spaces, lots of natural light, and areas where people could come together and share ideas. Vanessa watched from the sidelines, her heart swelling with pride. She'd always known Marcus had talent, but seeing him pour so much passion into something was new. One evening, as Marcus worked on the final details of his drawing, she placed a hand on his shoulder. "You're doing amazing, baby," she said softly. "No matter what happens, I'm proud of you." Marcus looked up at her, his eyes shining with determination. "Thanks, Mom. But I'm going to win this. You'll see." The day of the competition arrived faster than Marcus expected. The event was held in the city, inside a sprawling convention center filled with booths showcasing young artists' work. Marcus's stomach churned as he set up his display, his sketch pinned to a large board alongside his notes and design concepts. Kids from all over the state wandered the hall, their projects equally impressive. Some had sculptures, others elaborate digital designs. Marcus couldn't help but feel a pang of doubt. "What if I'm not good enough?" he whispered to himself. Vanessa, standing beside him, squeezed his hand. "You belong here, Marcus. Don't let anyone make you think otherwise." As the judges made their rounds, Marcus watched nervously. They stopped at his booth, studying his work carefully and asking him questions about his inspiration. He explained how he wanted to create a space where people could feel seen and supported, a place like the community center that had welcomed him when he needed it most. The judges nodded, their faces unreadable. When the winners were announced later that afternoon, Marcus held his breath as the MC read the names. And the grand prize for Dreams for Tomorrow goes to Marcus Lewis for his design, A Place to Belong. The room erupted into applause, but Marcus barely heard it. He was frozen, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. "Marcus," Vanessa exclaimed, pulling him into a hug. "You did it." Marcus stepped forward to accept his award, his hands trembling as he held the certificate. For the first time in his life, he felt like the world saw him, not as a poor kid from a struggling family, but as someone with talent, someone with a future. The scholarship opened doors Marcus had never imagined. That summer, he attended the architecture camp, where he learned about design principles, worked on real projects, and met mentors who encouraged him to dream bigger. Back at home, Vanessa thrived in her new job. The steady income allowed her to pay off their debts, and she even started saving for Marcus's college fund. Robert Harris continued to check in on them, offering guidance and support when needed. One day, as Marcus showed Robert his latest design, a concept for a low-cost housing project, Robert smiled and said, "You're going to change the world someday, kid." Years later, Marcus would look back on that pivotal moment in the parking lot and marvel at how much had changed. He'd go on to become an architect, designing buildings that prioritized community and connection. Vanessa would retire early, her hard work and sacrifices finally paying off. And Robert? He remained a constant presence in their lives, a reminder that kindness and courage have the power to ripple outward, transforming lives in ways no one could predict. Marcus's journey wasn't just about saving a life that day. It was about discovering his own potential and proving that even the smallest actions can lead to the greatest changes. As Marcus often said, it all started with one choice: to speak up. Years passed, but Marcus never forgot the pivotal day in the parking lot that changed everything. The lessons he learned from his mother's resilience, Robert Harris's kindness, and the opportunities he worked so hard to seize stayed with him as he built his life. By his late 20s, Marcus was no longer the shy, nervous boy clutching a sketchbook. He was now an architect with his own firm, specializing in community-focused designs. His projects aimed to give back to neighborhoods like the one he grew up in, places often overlooked but filled with people who just needed a chance to thrive. One of Marcus's most ambitious projects was in his hometown. It started with an abandoned building on the edge of town, the same one he used to pass every day as a kid. To everyone else, it was just an eyesore, but to Marcus, it was a blank canvas. "This could be the new community center," he told his team during their first site visit. "We'll give it everything I dreamed of as a kid: open spaces for kids to play, classrooms for adults to learn skills, and even a library, a real place to belong." The idea gained traction quickly. Local businesses chipped in funding, inspired by Marcus's story, and volunteers came forward to help with the construction. Even Robert Harris, now semi-retired, made a generous donation, jokingly saying, "I'm just glad I can finally invest in one of your projects instead of just hearing about them." When the building was completed, the grand opening was more than Marcus had ever imagined. Families poured in, marveling at the vibrant murals, the state-of-the-art classrooms, and the spacious play areas. The air buzzed with excitement and possibility. During the dedication ceremony, Marcus stood at the podium, looking out at the crowd. His mom was there, sitting front and center, her eyes brimming with tears. Robert stood beside her, clapping as Marcus stepped up to the microphone. "This place isn't just a building," Marcus began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "It's a reminder that every single one of us has the power to make a difference. Whether it's a kid who speaks up when something doesn't feel right, or a stranger who chooses to help instead of walking away. These small acts matter." He paused, glancing at his mom. "I wouldn't be standing here without the people who believed in me. My mom, who worked harder than anyone I've ever known to keep us afloat. And Mr. Harris, who saw potential in a kid with nothing to give but a little courage." The crowd erupted into applause, but Marcus wasn't finished. "This center is for everyone who's ever felt like they didn't belong, like they didn't have a voice. This is your place, a place to dream, to learn, to grow. And I hope it inspires you the way so many have inspired me." As the crowd dispersed, a young boy approached Marcus, clutching a crumpled piece of paper. He looked nervous, just like Marcus had so many years ago. "Mr. Lewis," the boy said quietly, I like to draw buildings too. Do you think I could be an architect one day?" Marcus crouched down, taking the paper from the boy's hands. It was a rough sketch of a house, not unlike the ones Marcus used to draw. "You've got a great start," Marcus said with a smile. "And if you keep working hard, there's no doubt in my mind that you'll be an amazing architect." The boy beamed, his confidence visibly growing in that single moment. Later that evening, Marcus and his mom sat on the steps of the new center, watching the sun set over the town. Vanessa leaned against him, her face serene. "You've done so much, Marcus," she said softly. "I hope you know how proud I am." Marcus smiled, looking at the building he'd helped create. "It's because of you, Mom. You always believed in me, even when things were at their hardest." Vanessa shook her head. "No, baby. You believed in yourself. That's what got you here." The community center became more than just a building. It became a symbol of hope for the town. Marcus continued to pour his heart into similar projects across the country, always staying true to his mission of giving back. He didn't just design structures. He built bridges between people, creating spaces where lives could change, just as his had so many years ago. And as Marcus stood in the glow of the community center's lights that night, he knew one thing for certain. Sometimes, all it takes to change the world is a boy who chooses to speak up when it matters most. Years later, A plaque was placed on the front wall of the community center, engraved with words that inspired generations to come. In honor of Marcus Lewis, a boy who saved a stranger's life and built a future for his own community. The years following the community center's success marked the beginning of something even greater for Marcus Lewis. His story spread far beyond his hometown, reaching people across the country. News outlets picked it up, not just as an inspiring tale of a boy who saved a stranger, but as a blueprint for what could happen when courage and opportunity intersect. As his reputation grew, Marcus found himself fielding calls from cities and organizations seeking his expertise. But for Marcus, it wasn't about fame or fortune. It was about staying true to his mission, creating spaces that empowered people to rise above their circumstances. One crisp fall afternoon, Marcus sat in his office, sketching ideas for a new project, when his assistant knocked on the door. "Mr. Lewis, there's someone here to see you," she said, a note of excitement in her voice. Marcus looked up, puzzled. "Who is it?" The assistant stepped aside, revealing an older man in a tailored suit. His graying hair and kind eyes were instantly familiar. "Mr. Harris?" Marcus exclaimed, standing to greet him. "What brings you here?" Robert Harris walked into the office, his presence as commanding as ever. But this time, there was a hint of humility in his demeanor. "I've been watching what you've done, Marcus," Robert began, sitting down. "You've turned a single act of kindness into a movement. And now, I want to help you take it even further." Marcus frowned slightly, unsure of what Robert meant. "I'm retiring for good this time," Robert continued. "I've built enough wealth for 2 lifetimes, and I want to make sure it's used for something meaningful. So, I'd like to create a foundation in your name, one that funds projects like yours all over the country." Marcus was stunned. "A foundation? For me?" Robert smiled. "For your vision. You've shown the world what's possible when someone believes in their community. I want to make sure more people have the chance to do what you've done." The Lewis Harris Foundation was launched a year later, with the mission of funding community development projects in underserved areas. Marcus became its spokesperson, traveling to cities and towns to meet with local leaders, assess needs, and help design programs tailored to their communities. The foundation's first project was a housing initiative in a struggling neighborhood in Chicago. Marcus worked closely with residents to design affordable, energy-efficient homes that reflected the culture and history of the area. "This isn't just about building houses," Marcus told the press at the groundbreaking ceremony. "It's about building hope, dignity, and a sense of belonging." The project was a resounding success, leading to similar initiatives in Detroit, New Orleans, and beyond. Through it all, Marcus never forgot his roots. He made regular visits to his hometown community center, mentoring young artists and architects who reminded him of himself. One day, during a visit, a teenage girl named Jada approached him with a sketchbook in hand. "Mr. Lewis, I want to show you something," she said shyly. Marcus smiled as he took the sketchbook and flipped through the pages. Her designs were intricate, thoughtful, and filled with the same kind of passion he'd had at her age. "These are incredible, Jada," he said. "What's your dream?" Jada hesitated, then said, "I want to design buildings that make people feel safe and happy, like the ones you do." Marcus nodded, seeing a spark in her eyes that reminded him of his own journey. "You can do that," he said. "And when you're ready, come find me. I'll make sure you have everything you need to succeed." As the foundation grew, so did its reach. Marcus began collaborating with international organizations, bringing his vision to communities in need around the world. From rebuilding schools in hurricane-ravaged areas to designing shelters for refugees, the work expanded far beyond what he'd ever imagined. In one particularly memorable project, Marcus traveled to a small village in Africa where families lived in makeshift huts. With the help of local architects, he designed sustainable homes using materials readily available in the region. The project not only provided shelter, but also created jobs and revitalized the local economy. "This isn't just architecture," Marcus told a reporter. "This is humanity. And it's proof that no matter where you start, you can make a difference." Despite his growing acclaim, Marcus never sought recognition for his work, but the world noticed. At 35, he was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom for his contributions to community development and social justice. At the ceremony, Marcus stood before a packed audience, his mom watching proudly from the front row. "This isn't about me," Marcus said in his speech. "This is about all the people who believed in me when I didn't know how to believe in myself. My mom, who taught me resilience. Mr. Harris, who gave me an opportunity. And every person who's ever dared to dream of a better world. This medal belongs to all of you." As Marcus looked ahead, he knew his work was far from done. There were still communities to uplift, still dreams to nurture. But he also knew he wasn't doing it alone anymore. Through the Lewis Harris Foundation, Marcus had created a network of dreamers and doers, all working toward the same goal, a world where everyone had a place to belong. And every time he stood before a new group of kids, sketchbook in hand, he told them the same thing. Your dreams matter. Speak up, take action, and never stop believing in what's possible. Because you never know. What you do today might change the world tomorrow. The legacy Marcus built was more than just bricks and mortar. It was a testament to the power of courage, kindness, and the belief that one small act can ripple outward to change countless lives.